I give pre-concert talks before our concert, so if you're a regular, welcome, or somebody who just comes once in a while, and if this is your first time, you just happened in, welcome. Enjoy yourselves. This is an incredible church, a beautiful space, and it's wonderful for concerts as well, and we will be, of course, starting very soon. Today, I wanted to talk briefly about the kind of repertoire that we have. I touch on this in my pre-concert talks because it's fascinating to me, even though I've been doing this for a long time, choosing the repertoire, the 2 or 3 pieces we do on each of our 5 concerts, so the dozen or 15 works during the course of the year. And it's something that I work on assiduously because it's important for multiple reasons. So the programs are all have, a good flow, so to speak, through the 2 or 3 pieces that we perform as well as for the season. And of course I do this very importantly for you, our wonderful audience, so you enjoy the concerts and the repertoire that I choose and that we play, but also of course for the musicians, because this being a volunteer orchestra, as I tell people, although it kind of sounds hard-edged, that the members of the orchestra are here because they want to be here. They're not getting paid with pensions, 401ks, and the like, and they don't get 6 weeks off vacation time. Well, they can do that, but they don't get paid. So, as I said, they're here because they want to be here. So, when I choose repertoire, it's kind of intriguing for those of you who might have noticed, if you've come to several concerts this year, or looked at our online brochure, so to speak, that has the repertoire for all 5 of the concerts. I actually didn't notice this until well into the season, that something kind of rare and wonderful happened. And that is that we only performed 1 symphony by a composer this entire season. And almost always when you go to an orchestra concert, or if you go to 2 or 3, virtually every concert will have a symphony, multi-movement work. Many of you have heard this before. You know what it is, symphonies by the sons of Bach, Haydn, Mozart, all the way through Beethoven and Brahms, into Mahler and Shostakovich, Prokofiev, for something like 2.5 centuries. The symphony has been the significant genre of work that typically ends a program. And then there are companion pieces. And the other genre, which is kind of, I think, probably the next most important, certainly it is to this orchestra, is the concerto, where you have usually an individual soloist, an instrumentalist accompanied by the orchestra, and then the rest of the programs are kind of filled out by shorter works, like be they from brief 20th century works, 5 or 10 minutes, or perhaps an overture or so. And it so happens, as I mentioned a moment ago, that we only had 1 symphony, and that was the Prokofiev 5th Symphony we performed on our last concert. And this was kind of happenstance for a number of reasons. I didn't do this on purpose. But another interesting thing happened, and that was that we performed, at the end of this concert, we will have performed 3 concertos. And typically we do 1 or 2 as part of our Cooner youth competition. And it just so happens the last few years I've had so many incredible young musicians audition in the fall for our competition. We usually held traditionally just in January, at the end of January, where we have our 3rd concert of the year. But we've had so many wonderful players that the last 3 or 4 years at least, and before the pandemic as well, where we had to take the hiatus. We've had at least 2 I should say. And this year I invited back a soloist who won the competition several years ago. So we had 3 violin concertos this year, all with incredibly wonderful people, human beings, as well as great musicians. The curious thing about this year is that we had several pieces on 3 of them, in fact, that are suites. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of detail because for those of you who listen to a symphony and listen to a suite, S-U-I-T-E, typically the format is, macro format is very similar. You have 3 or 4 or 5 standalone pieces which are necessarily related In suites, oftentimes the movements are not related to each other because the name itself doesn't invoke the following, but very typically suites are extracted from ballet music, like Prometheus Romeo and Juliet, where there's something like 2 hours of music, and he himself extracted 3 different suites of 20 or 30 minutes of, clearly purely instrumental music, as well as from operas. And many of the great operas, not so much Wagner, but many other operas have had suites extracted from them that are purely instrumental, and the orchestra's played several of these. For instance, several years ago, we played a suite from Der Rosenkavalier by Richard Strauss, and there are several suites. The one form I wanted to talk about, just to let you know a little bit about its existence, is what's referred to as either a tone poem, T-O-N-E, or a symphonic poem. And this is a form which is much less younger than the symphony, which, as I mentioned, begins pretty much 300 years ago, 1730s or 40s. The multi-movement form that has first and fourth movements are quick. The second movement is a slow movement. The third is a dance movement, typically. Originally was a minuet, and then it sped up gradually. No, I mean, it didn't speed up, but composers wrote quicker and quicker minuets and started calling them scherzos. Beethoven started this. So instead of 1, 2, 3, they became 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Dvorak did this as well. And so back to the tone poem, this has only been with us for less than 100 years, since pretty much the 1750s. Originally, if you will, created by or developed intensively by the great pianist of the mid-19th century, Franz Liszt, who, by the way, in case you were wondering if you want to win a competition, and the competition is who was the first music superstar? It was Franz Liszt. Supposedly, according to announcements, when he played, people fainted at his performances. He was a pianist, and he had titanic technique. One of the tricks he did was to play a Beethoven symphony on the piano all by himself, all the parts, with his 10 digits. I don't think he used his feet. Okay, sorry. But the symphonic poem was originally intended as a single movement that, because it grew up in the Romantic era, in other words, post-1830, it necessarily invoked a story and had a plot. And so several of these works, and in fact, you can actually almost hear what's going on in the action. Case in point is Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, which is entitled a symphonic poem, but basically is, where you can actually hear a section where the Capulets, the two families, are fighting it out. There's a love scene with, I've almost said Romeo in the balcony. Sorry, that's the other way around. In any case, we did it earlier this year by a woman composer named Augusta Holmes, Andromede, or Andromeda, a tone poem, a single standalone movement that had different tempi in it, changed tempo from fast to slow, and again had kind of evoked a storyline, or at least a concept, a kind of dramatic concept. The first piece on the program is by Frank Bridge, the early 20th century composer, the English composer, who unfortunately, his main claim to fame is that he was the teacher, significant teacher of Benjamin Britten, one of the great 20th century composers of operas and numerous chamber works, songs and whatnot, and orchestra works as well. But Frank Bridge actually was quite prolific. It just so happens like this happens, and it's a very strange thing. It's difficult to understand. You know this probably in the fields that you're in. Some people become famous, the work that they do, and other people kind of disappear. And Frank Bridge wrote numerous beautiful pieces. And this piece, which nobody in the orchestra had heard before, let alone played, I'd like to do this as well, surprise something on them, is basically an extended, separate movement symphonic poem. And you'll see when you look at your notes, the wonderful notes we have in the program, that it evokes the sea, if you will, and the different aspects of the sea, where moonlight, where there's calm, the storm scene, etc. And it does it, curiously enough, almost like a hybrid, but it's not, of a symphony, because in fact it is in 4 movements. The first movement is kind of a moderate tempo. The last movement, the storm, is quick and intense. The second movement is the dance movement, actually titled Scherzo, goes quickly. And the third movement is kind of slow and luxurious and very elegiac, very beautiful. But it's a wonderful piece. And sometimes pieces take this form that are symphonic poems, separate movements like a symphony. Case in point, I suspect more than a few of you know the very famous piece, La Mer, which is also the sea, if you will, in French, by Claude Debussy, which was composed just 5 years before the Frank Bridge piece. And I looked up, I did my little research, and the Debussy was actually composed in 1905 and performed in London in 1908. And Mr. Bridge wrote this piece, you're going to hear first on the program, in 1910. So clearly the concept of the sea and the idea influenced Mr. Bridge, because being a teacher and being of course, a great pedagogue at that time, early 20th century, as well as superb composer, he kept his ear out for all the new compositions, although, of course, it's pre-recordings for the most part. So that's just an interesting coincidence. The 2 pieces are radically different, however, other than the fact that they both evoke these scenes that necessarily represent the calmness of the ocean or the sea and the rippling of the waves, especially at night, versus the storm sequences. And it's a very dramatic piece. The other piece on the program is in our good old friend, the concerto, in this case, the Violin Concerto of Jean Sibelius, a piece that was only composed a few years before the Frank Bridge piece by one of the titans of the first half of the 20th century, Jean Sibelius. Unlike many composers, I implied this more than said, a number of composers the second half of the 19th century stuck to the symphony form, Dvorak, Brahms, Mahler, and didn't really compose these single movement symphonic poems. But Mr. Jean Sibelius, in fact, kind of visited both forms. He had kind of omnivorous, if you will, tastes in genres, and was an incredibly prolific composer. He composed for more than 70 years. And his music is exquisite, it's beautiful, some of the works beloved. Finlandia, of course, was politically very important. It's a tone poem. And the Tsar Bandit, as a matter of fact, its performance, because it was a nationalist piece. And I don't mean this in the sense of, a lot of people who go around these days in different parts of the world who call themselves nationalists, who are in fact perhaps racist, but this was nationalists in promoting the separate culture of Finland. Sibelius composed 7 incredible symphonies and 11 tone poems. So he kind of dabbled in, if you will, in both forms. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of taste of this evocative aspects of what's going on in the first piece, especially. Sibelius is a standard concerto. Saying the word standard is unique because I'm a violinist and it's a beloved piece for all violinists, and if you've not heard it before, it's spectacular, as is our soloist today. And I'll introduce him in the second half before after intermission. But the concerto, when you listen to it, is standard form, meaning a fairly quick first movement, a quick third movement, and a very sensuous, luxurious, slow second movement with a spectacular young soloist. So I hope you enjoy the program.